Hello and welcome to MEELive. Join us as together we take another look at the big stories that are shaping our world.
We are broadcasting live to YouTube from Middle East Eye's headquarters here in London.
I'm Mohammed Hassan.
And I'm Matilda Mallinson. Today is Thursday, the 22nd of May.
Matilda, what do you have for us today?
Today, for our deep dive after the headlines, we will be looking at the situation in Gaza because today is the first day in 80 days that aid trucks have been allowed to enter the enclave. However, it is seemingly under strict conditions imposed by Netanyahu's government after they have announced their new plan for aid in Gaza. And there are fears that these plans involve weaponizing aid to further the goals of ethnic cleansing in the enclave. So we will be finding out what is really happening. We're speaking to a UN spokesperson, James Elder, and also Palestinian from Gaza, Mohammed Shahada, who is currently in Europe, and he'll be telling us about the situation on the ground. And then, Mohammed, I think you are bringing us the updates on a major breaking news story.
Yeah, now we're going to dig into that in just a second, but you would have heard about the shooting in Washington, D.C. last night. 2 Israeli embassy staff were killed outside of an event for Jewish diplomats. Why did it happen? Who was involved? What do we know about this suspect who is now in police custody? All of that and more in just a second.
But first, let's take a look at the headlines.
Two Israeli embassy staff were shot and killed outside a Jewish museum in Washington, D.C. last night. Yaron Lechinsky and Sarah Lynn Milgram were standing outside a social event for young diplomats when a gunman approached them and opened fire. Witnesses say the man has been pacing along the street in the lead up to the incident and then entered the Capitol Jewish Museum building following the shooting. Police arrested the suspect, 30-year-old Elias Rodriguez, who reportedly surrendered before chanting, "Free Palestine."
Free Palestine! Free Palestine! Free Palestine!
And we'll be joined by Middle East Eye's reporter in D.C., Sean Matthews, later in the program.
A member of Irish rap trio Kneecap has been charged with a terror offence in the UK. Liam O'Hanna, who uses the stage name Mochara, is accused of displaying a flag in support of Hezbollah at a gig in London in 2024. A Metropolitan Police spokesperson announced earlier in April that it was investigating the group after having been made aware of video footage. The group has denied the charge against O'Hanna, who is due to appear in court on the 18th of June, and labelled it political policing and a carnival of distraction. A statement posted on their social media reads, 14,000 babies are about to die of starvation in Gaza, with food sent by the world sitting on the other side of a wall. And once again, the British establishment is focused on us. Since the group's founding in 2017, Kneecap has often faced controversy over its political expression, including anti-colonial and Irish Republican views. Hezbollah is a Lebanese political party and paramilitary group founded in response to the Israeli invasion of 1982. It is prescribed as a terrorist organization in the UK, making it a crime to express solidarity for the group or party.
And finally, world leaders have expressed outrage after Israeli soldiers fired warning shots at foreign diplomats during a visit to the occupied West Bank. The delegation included representatives of the European Union, the UK, Turkey, Mexico, and China, who were on an official tour through the Jenin refugee camp when 2 Israeli soldiers began firing into the air. Footage shows the diplomats running for cover as the sound of assault rifles is heard in the background. Israel's foreign ministry says in a statement on social media the soldiers had fired warning shots to scare the group away after they entered an area where they were not authorized to be. But more than a dozen world leaders have hit back, demanding a full investigation into the incident, while Canada and France summoned the Israeli ambassador asking for an explanation. Germany's foreign minister told his Israeli counterpart that there needed to be consequences. In a statement, the Foreign Office said it, quote, strongly condemns this unprovoked fire. We can count ourselves lucky that nothing more serious occurred. The incident comes a day after the EU said it would review its political and economic agreement with Israel in light of the ongoing assault on the Gaza Strip. Stay with us now as we turn to Gaza, where the denial of humanitarian aid has pushed its residents to the brink of famine.
This is MEELive's Deep Dive, where we dive into a story shaking up the world. After 80 days under siege, trucks carrying aid have entered Gaza, following several days of delays at the Kerem Shalom crossing, the single route Israel has approved for distribution. The UN Humanitarian Agency confirmed the entry of about 90 trucks, blaming delays on insecurity that comes with concentrating insufficient aid in one place, particularly looting. The total cohort constitutes a fraction of what aid groups say is needed to relieve Gaza's starving population, as airstrikes and a ground offensive continue to pound the territory. Israel's state-endorsed famine has contributed to shifting international support against them. 22 countries and the entire EU called on Netanyahu to immediately re-allow aid into Gaza. And for the first time on Tuesday, 3 key US allies signed a joint statement condemning Israel for breaching international law. Faced with mounting pressure abroad, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu pledged last week to implement a new aid system in the enclave. But as details of that plan have emerged, they have done more to raise alarms than to relieve them. On Monday, Netanyahu laid out his proposal.
מתחילת המלחמה אמרנו שכדי להשלים את הניצחון, להכריע את החמאס ולשחרר את כל חטופינו, שתי משימות שמשולבות זו בזו, יש תנאי אחד הכרחי. אסור לנו להגיע למצב של רעב, גם מבחינה עניינית, גם מבחינה מדינית. פשוט לא יתמכו בנו, לא נוכל להשלים את משימת הניצחון. יש לנו מלחימה עצימה ועצומה, ויש התקרבות. אנחנו הולכים להשתלט על כל שטחי הרצועה. זה מה שאנחנו הולכים לעשות. ודבר נוסף, אני פשוט מצדיע למילואימניקים, אני מצדיע ללוחמים שלנו בסדיר, הם עושים שם עבודה נהדרת, כולל הבוקר, אני לא יכול להיכנס לכל הפרטים, אנחנו לא מוותרים. אבל כדי לעשות את זה, צריך לעשות את זה באופן כזה שלא יעצרו אותנו.
Here are 3 things we learned there. 1, under Netanyahu's plan, access to aid distributions would be fully controlled by the Israeli military. 2, anyone Israel considers Hamas-affiliated will get nothing, and given the minimal amount of aid being allowed in, and the fact that Israel has repeatedly targeted medics, journalists, and civilians by claiming, without evidence, that they are Hamas-affiliated, there is cause to believe many civilians could be denied here. And 3, here. The third thing that is pointed out here is that Netanyahu has confirmed in his plan the distribution will be done in partnership with American-based companies and charities. So what do we know about these American friends? The plan is for aid to be done. The plan is for aid to be carried out by a private charity known as the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. This was founded in February and is backed by the US and Israeli governments, and it would rely on US-backed security firms, privately contracted security firms, in order to carry out these aid deliveries. Netanyahu's new plan not only has the backing of Israel's far right, who have firmly fought against lifting the aid blockade, but it also appears to have originated there. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, head of the religious Zionism party, took personal credit for the plan on Monday in a speech that revealed the decision-making process behind it. 2 clips are particularly telling.
בחודשים האחרונים הובלתי דרישה בלתי מתפשרת לשינוי של 180 מעלות באופן חלוקת הסיוע ההומניטרי, כך שהוא לא יגיע לחמאס ולא ישמש כסיוע לוגיסטי לאויב בשעת מלחמה. מינימום נדרש שיגיע לאוכלוסייה, פשוט כדי שהעולם לא יעצור אותנו ויאשים אותנו בפשעי מלחמה. אין מי שזעק את זה בכתב ובעל פה, בתוך הקבינט ומחוצה לו, יותר ממני, ואתם יודעים את זה. וברוך השם הצלחתי.
Here, Smotrich says the government's goal is to allow the minimum amount of aid required so the world does not stop us and accuse us of war crimes. And here's the second clip.
זה שינוי אדיר ממה שהיה עד כה, וזה בעזרת השם יביא לניצחון, להשמדת חמאס ולהשבת החטופים. במסגרת המלחמה צה"ל מניע אוכלוסייה מאזורי הלחימה ולא משאיר אבן על אבן. אני אומר לכם, פשוט תסתכלו על הסרטונים של מה שקורה ברצועת עזה. האוכלוסייה תגיע לדרום הרצועה, ומשם בעזרת השם למדינות שלישיות. במסגרת תוכנית הנשיא טראמפ, זה שינוי של מהלך ההיסטוריה, לא פחות.
And here the finance minister describes a strategy of using aid to pull Gaza's population to the southern border from where they can be removed from the strip altogether. Now, if true, this could amount to ethnic cleansing, and Smotrich says it will be done in the framework of President Trump's plan. But Israel's plan to create a handful of aid hubs exclusively in the south of the Strip, catering to a fraction of overall need, was swiftly condemned by the international groups who manage global aid at the moment, groups like the UN, who have firmly refused to comply. UNICEF spokesperson James Elder is joining us now to explain the UN and other groups' objections and update us on the current aid situation in Gaza. James, welcome to MEELive.
Hi there.
This week, the UN released one of its most urgent warnings yet about the imminent starvation in Gaza, saying 14,000 babies were at immediate risk. For the past weeks, trucks of aid have been barred from entering Gaza while children just across the border go hungry. Have you ever seen anything like this?
No, this is largely unprecedented. Look, we've had situations, there's no doubt, where you get either a famine or famine-like conditions, but normally they're in very, very remote areas. They're very difficult to get to. They're often out of the world's attention. You need to do airdrops. It's a very inefficient way of getting aid. The difference here, of course, is that there is literally enough food to feed 1 million people for 4 months just on the other side of the border. As all your viewers know, Gaza is very, very close to where many people are living very well. So no, this is unprecedented because it's been a blockade. 20 months of indiscriminate attacks, killing an insane number of people, 15,000, 16,000 girls and boys. And then after a ceasefire showed what could be done in terms of improving the malnutrition status, letting people go home, even though home was putting a tent up over rubble, getting hostages home. This is a ceasefire. And then 11 weeks of a blockade. We've seen malnutrition rates double. We've seen, again, hospitals run perilously low on medical supplies. We see families, 9 out of 10 families have to choose with water. Do they drink it or do they use it to wash? This is the result. We've got to a point where those in Gaza should never have been to, but the level of desperation or of depression is now at all-time highs on the back of this 11 weeks of an aid blockade.
Why then will the UN not comply with or reject Israel's plan to allow in small amounts of aid?
So the plan, a couple of reasons. The most simple reason is, of course, that the UN has a modality to bring in aid. This is what the United Nations does, whether it's Sudan or Afghanistan or Ukraine, Yemen. This is what the United Nations has been doing with very brave partners, very brave Palestinian national groups on the ground. This is what we've been doing since World War II. And as we saw during the ceasefire, around 500 trucks a day. So there's no need for a separate form of aid. There's no need to privatize it. And as you rightly said, the aim of that is to drag people, use it as bait, drag them from the north down to the south. So that's dangerous. It's a militarized zone. People, the whole point of humanitarian aid is you go to where the need is. That's because it's right in principle, but it's also right in practice. You have the elderly, you have the sick, you have an incredible number of injured people. So you cannot, in principle or practice, push people to the south and then even then have a handful of distribution points. During that ceasefire, the United Nations and our Palestinian partners on the ground were using about 400 different points to deliver aid. This private entity is looking at literally half a dozen, so half a dozen versus 400. At the same time, humanitarian aid isn't just about getting into the arms of a mum or of a grandfather. It's about supplying bakeries. It's about supplying hospitals. It's about rebuilding nutritional system, rebuilding water systems is a big thing UNICEF does. So there's so much more to humanitarian aid than this entity is offering. And as I say, beyond anything else, the umbrella to this is the United Nations and those brave partners on the ground have proved they can do what works if they're given the chance, if they're allowed to bring in the amount of aid that is required and to be able to do it safely. You know, there are more United Nations colleagues have been killed in Gaza than in any other war since the advent of the United Nations.
Perhaps you can help us make sense of the situation today then, because some 90 aid trucks did enter Gaza today for the first time in 11 weeks. Does that mean Israel has temporarily agreed to resume international aid? Or does it mean that the UN is partially complying with Israel's new aid plan? Just help us make sense of this.
No, the aid plan that you refer to, that the private sector is not up and running, and it's very clear from the highest levels of the UN that they won't cooperate with it. They can't. It is, you know, humanitarian principles should stand for something, but of course in Gaza we've seen, you know, international norms and principles absolutely devastated in the same way we've seen agriculture, the economy, hospitals, the lives of girls and boys devastated. Practically, it just doesn't work. So what's happening now is that the United Nations is being allowed to take in aid because of that severe international pressure, but not the amount we need. Now, look, of course, we welcome every truck, we welcome every pallet. When you're someone like me who talks every day to those on the ground in Gaza and hears from mothers who haven't eaten for 2 days because they give their food to their children, or you speak to a grandparent who buys a portion of a fruit, of course, any part of aid, anything is important, but we cannot pretend that this trickle is a solution to the man-made catastrophe. So we can't let this be tokenistic. We can't let this be a smokescreen. If this is a real intent to stop a famine in the Gaza Strip, to make sure doctors have the medical supplies they need, to make sure disease doesn't spread, then we need hundreds of trucks a day. That needs a full facilitation from the Israeli authorities. It needs multiple routes across the Gaza Strip, not just the current one that we have now. And we insist that it means we can get to the south, to Rafah, to Khan Yunis, to Jabalia in the north, not just to a few pockets on the Gaza Strip. We have to be able to reach everyone.
Now, the US private charity that is supposedly going to start delivering Israel's aid plan from May is backed by the US and by Israel. Is there anything that you can tell us about it? What do we know about the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation? Are they obliged to follow, international procedure, standardized international law when it comes to the delivery of aid? What do we know about them?
Yeah, I mean, yes, it would be a complete aberration for all the reasons I say. So we don't know a lot more than we read, and that their aims are a handful of distribution points, and again, forcing people to move from the north to the south. The capacity isn't there. The distribution points are not there. There's no discussion about medicines, anesthetics. There's a huge number of women who are giving preterm birth in Gaza. Those babies need incubators. UNICEF's got dozens of incubators on the other side of the border. So what we know is that they seem to be a private sector, not a charity, a private sector organization designed to support the forced displacement of people from the north to the south against every single humanitarian principle, and utterly unworkable.
Now, this is happening in the context in which the US President Donald Trump has spoken out against the UN. The Israeli Prime Minister has spoken out against the UN. We have seen the UN and international NGOs being blockaded from the territory. And now this new group coming in. Are there concerns that the UN is being displaced by this group, or that the standard system we currently have for the international delivery of aid is being replaced with something else?
Oh, look, the enormous concerns from day one of this, that we can't reach the number of people who need the support. That's been a constant from the highest level of the Secretary General to my Executive Director, this idea that, as my Executive Director said in November 2023, you will not bring peace to the Middle East by killing of so many children and the destruction of Gaza. Now, the United Nations has proved time and again, World Food Programme, UNRWA, UNICEF, WHO, they know exactly what to do. They have the experience. We have what's called last mile delivery. So for UNICEF, that means, taking a vaccine, getting it to the child, getting it in the child's arm, getting that magical nutritional food that brings a malnourished child back to life, getting that through all the hoops, all the bureaucracy, getting it to the child. This is what the United Nations does. This is what it needs to be allowed to do. No other entity can walk in and do that. There is just far too much experience, far too many people on the ground. We've got thousands of people who are part of this machinery, this well-oiled machinery that's been working for decades and decades. Remembering, during the ceasefire, 400 distribution points. This private entity talking about half a dozen.
And final question, Netanyahu has justified his aid proposal as necessary to prevent looting by Hamas. How real is the threat of looting to aid groups in Gaza, and how central is Hamas to that problem?
Well, the UN's been very, very clear on the problem of looting, and that's when you break a society, when you remove all sense of law and order, when you then restrict, block, completely deny anything that a person requires to survive for 11 weeks, and then allow a single route, only give one road in, there will be looting. The United Nations has spoken about that. That's why we need so much more aid and so many more routes. There was no looting during the ceasefire when we flooded the Gaza Strip with aid. So that's a very, very clear point to make. When it comes to aid diversion, it's frustrating. It's very, very frustrating. It has been for a long time. For an organisation like UNICEF, as I say, we are last mile delivery, vaccine into the arm of a child, nutritional food into the mouth of that child. The proof is simply not there. And if you want to see the truth, as we've said for a long time, allow international journalists on the ground to stand side by side, the very brave Palestinian journalists, and show the reality to global audiences.
James Elder, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
Now, as James confirmed, even if Israel begins to deliver the basic amount of food it has promised, its policies have already created catastrophic starvation risk for millions. Mohammed Shahada is a political analyst and writer from Gaza, currently working at the European Council of Foreign Relations in Copenhagen. I spoke to him this afternoon about how his loved ones back home are surviving under siege. But first, he reacted to the Israeli government's explicit plan to use aid to remove Palestinians from the territory.
Detailed conversations with a number of Palestinians on the ground in Gaza, colleagues and family and friends, as well as with UN officials and European diplomats over the last 2 weeks. Every single person I spoke to looked at this idea with complete horror. They describe it as sinister, dystopian, and extremely dangerous. It is basically a bait, a tool of blackmail, a tool of just institutionalizing the starvation that Israel has been inflicting on Gaza for the last 20 months, and a tool for forcible expulsion, where Israel would tell people, if you want food, come to Rafah, otherwise you will starve to death. This is the most dangerous we've been until now in terms of a sinister exploitation of aid for the sake of war crimes and crimes against humanity, the top of which is genocide.
Smotrich's justification is, of course, preventing aid getting into the hands of Hamas. Is that valid?
It's absolutely lunatic and completely disingenuous. The UN says that if you want to prevent looting in Gaza, the answer is not to reduce people's food to the least of the least, as Smotrich put it, the very minimum of the very minimum, because that scarcity is what incentivizes looting in the first place. When a bag of wheat flour in Gaza right now costs 2,500 shekels, almost $700, that's when you would give people incentive to loot those bags because it pays off. But when you flood Gaza with aid, when prices go back to normal, and when humanitarian organizations are able to deliver these packages for free, there's basically no incentive for looting. It is Israel's genocide that incentivizes the looting, not Hamas or other groups in Gaza.
How are people surviving at the moment? It's been months under siege, starvation is on the rise, and then there is this additional issue of this massive security vacuum. How are your family and friends in Gaza surviving?
Well, there's suffering, there's catastrophe, there's dystopia, and then there is Gaza. Gaza is beyond words. I cannot even start to describe how it is. So I was talking to a close friend yesterday. He said he stored some wheat flour during the ceasefire that he's going through now. It's full of maggots, it's full of bugs. It's rotten, but that's the only thing that he can feed his family at the moment. Another colleague of mine, Nada, a breastfeeding mother, she said she's collapsing all the time. She's passing out, and she sees people on the street when they go out every morning. They start going at 5 in the morning until sunset, scraping and desperately looking for food. And people are passing out on the street as well. Hospitals became overwhelmed with malnourished and severely starved Gazans, especially children. That when another colleague of mine went to take her mother to a hospital for urgent medical treatment, the hospital turned her back. They said, we have to ration the medicines, we have to ration our resources and food we have at the moment at the staff. So we prioritize children and we prioritize people wounded by Israeli airstrikes who need like immediate life-saving surgery. So she had to take her mother home and watch her die. Nada, my colleague, the breastfeeding mother, she wrote me a message recently, early on, in which she said, Muhammad, I cannot breastfeed anymore. There's no water. There's barely salty water. I'm afraid my son's gonna die. And she was asking for practical advice. She was not being polemic. She said, how do I stay sane when he dies before my eyes? How do I keep my mind together? That was the main advice she was asking for. Another friend of mine, his sister, saw her entire family killed in one airstrike. She has 6 kids. Her husband was kidnapped or disappeared because he was working at a hospital. She doesn't know anything about him, and she basically has gone insane. Her brother is saying that her cognitive functions have deteriorated significantly out of being abandoned in this situation. And the most heartbreaking of all those sceneries that we're seeing from Gaza are basically kids with amputated limbs that have become orphans, lone survivors of families that were completely extinguished by Israel, that are standing in these infinite lines begging for scraps of food, and there's no one to take care of them, and there's no shelter for them to be at. So there is, as I said, there is horror, there is dystopia, and then there is Gaza. It's beyond anything that can be described in words. And with all of these unfolding, undescribable tragedies, you have Israel carpet bombing them every single day. It's like one of these most horror sci-fi movies from the future. You have drones that are armed to shoot to kill or to bomb people to smithereens, that are literally hovering on top of your head, that literally in the evening you would see a drone approaching the tent area with a flashlight and opening it, inspecting people, choosing who to kill and who to spare. And in that entire atmosphere, you have every single day Israeli decision makers coming and saying, our enemies are the entire population there, with no way to run away from it.
Now, with these horrifying realities, the aid blockade has provoked some of the fiercest condemnation yet from the international community about Israel's actions in Gaza. Commentators and governments who previously defended Israel have, for the first time, used terms such as genocide, such as war crimes. Is this backlash reaching people in Gaza? Does it provide any hope?
I was talking to a close friend yesterday or the day before, and he brought it up himself. He said the statements that were issued by those 22 European countries, the other statement, I think, by Canada, France, and the United Kingdom, and these recent diplomatic steps are giving them some hope out of despair, out of complete desperation. They're clinging to any hope they can find. And they see that, okay, there is some renewed momentum after Gaza had disappeared for a very long time. Headlines have been for months and months only about Trump, and nothing about the genocide that's unfolding. There was this deliberate effort to relegate it to the bottom of the news. And now it is coming back to prominence again. But at the same time, there's this settled feeling that all those statements, all those media rhetorics and gymnastics are just empty words, and that the world has made a decision to abandon Gaza to its fate, where Israel is now tightening the screws more and more on the people that are still there, for them to either perish, languish and die, or try anything possible to escape. So I think like the rhetorics that came out of Europe over the last couple of days were encouraging. They were a good first step. They were remarkable compared to their performance earlier, but it's still incredibly short of anything remote to what is needed to live up to this genocidal moment.
Another international community reaction I want your view on is that of UN groups that have refused to comply with Israel's new proposals for aid. Also on this program, I speak to UNICEF about this decision. But of course, with so few other alternatives to get food, I wonder how people in Gaza feel about this decision by humanitarian groups not to comply.
Every single person I spoke to in Gaza said one has to be completely insane, out of their minds, to step a foot in those heavily militarized concentration camps that Israel is setting up in Rafah, where you have to pass through numerous checkpoints with Israeli genocidal soldiers teaming around it, waiting to ambush whoever they want. And you have to pass through facial recognition technology, fingerprinting, different layers of screening and vetting with undisclosed criteria. And at the end of it, you have to literally walk from Beit Hanun, 41 kilometers to Rafah, to pick up a package that would weigh 20 to 40 kilos, and then 41 kilometers back under constant bombardment, thinking that you will make it back alive. Nobody in Gaza thinks that if you step a foot in those compounds, you will make it back home alive on your feet. Either you will be killed on the way, you will be kidnapped by the Israeli soldiers, you will be blackmailed into collaborating with Israel, or the food that you would get would be looted on the way. But then there's the other element of it that people are afraid about, the forcible expulsion. That all those hubs are established, 3 of them are established in Rafah. One of them is to be established to the south of the Netzarim corridor, where Israel would tell people the only way you can get food, leave your home, leave northern Gaza, and move to the borders with Egypt for the final phase of the genocide to be implemented, where Israel would push them a few hundred meters further into Egypt, into the Sinai desert. Then there's the other element of basically using this as an ultimate tool of dictating who lives and who dies, because it's only 60% of Gaza that would receive this aid, according to the organization itself, according to Israel itself, only 60%, which means Israel would pick and choose who gets aid and who dies. It is like dystopian by every metric you choose. You're wielding it as a weapon to further the genocide, to debilitate the entire population, collectively punish them, while pretending to allow any food in, but you're practically not.
It sounds like there's a pretty clear picture in your head of what this aid plan by Israel ultimately tells us about the war. There are, of course, countless competing accounts seeking to explain or justify the violence in Gaza. Netanyahu calls it a war of self-defense for the sake of Israeli survival. Some of his critics say that it's his personal bid to cling onto political power. What do you say? What does this aid plan tell us about Netanyahu's government's intentions in Gaza?
Well, Netanyahu, there's a common talking point for analysts where they say that Netanyahu is afraid of ending the war because that would be the end of his political career, or his government would collapse, or Smotrich and Ben Gvir would leave government. I think this is a fig leaf. The main interest of Netanyahu, it is Netanyahu that wants to see this happen. It is not the far-right coalition. He is the far-right. And he wants to see it happen because the Israeli government now sees a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to finish what they say, what Ben Gurion failed to accomplish, what Ben Gurion failed to complete, which is expelling the entire Palestinian population between the river and the sea. At least if you expel the ones in Gaza, that is the demo, the pilot project for the others that would follow in the West Bank as well. And Netanyahu is not that much concerned with the collapse of the government as much as he's literally concerned with reshaping his legacy after the October 7 failure to be the Israeli leader that expanded Israel's borders, that managed to finish the job, to finish off the Gaza question. And that is the main concern. So it is a campaign that where Israel would continue to bomb and pound and starve Gaza indefinitely to collapse and break the will of people there so that they would choose to leave, even if Israel doesn't force them on trucks, that as soon as the borders are open, the overwhelming majority of Gazans would be sort of engineered into wanting to leave this area. And that is the basic goal.
Mohammed Shahada, thank you for your time. Next up, we spotlight the shooting in DC of Israeli embassy staff, widely flagged as anti-Semitic, and find out what's been confirmed about the motive.
Welcome back. We return now to the killing of 2 Israeli diplomatic staff in Washington, D.C. The shooting occurred last night, late last night outside the Capitol Jewish Museum, where the American Jewish Committee was hosting an event called the Young Diplomats Reception. The suspect, 30-year-old Chicago native Elias Rodriguez, was seen pacing outside the event before approaching a group of 4 attendees and opening fire at close range. In a video recording of the moment of his arrest, Rodriguez could be heard shouting, quote, "Free Palestine." The 2 victims had been identified as 30-year-old Yaron Lechinsky and 26-year-old Sarah Lynn Milgram. According to the Israeli Foreign Ministry, 30-year-old Lechinsky was a research assistant at the embassy, while 26-year-old Milgram organized trips to Israel. Embassy staff say they're mourning the loss of their 2 colleagues who were reportedly set to be engaged to each other next week in Jerusalem. Reactions from a number of officials have blamed the attack on anti-Semitism. One of them, Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Yetshel Later, who called the shooting a moral depravity.
We are a resilient people. The people of Israel are resilient people, and the people of the United States of America are resilient people. Together we won't be afraid, together we'll stand, and we're going to overcome moral depravity of people who think that they're going to achieve political gains through murder.
U.S. President Donald Trump took to Truth Social late last night, saying, quote, "These horrible D.C. killings, based obviously on anti-Semitism, must end now. Hatred and radicalism have no place in the USA." While Secretary of State Marco Rubio tweeted, quote, "This was a brazen act of cowardly anti-Semitic violence. Make no mistake, we will track down those responsible and bring them to justice." So what do we know so far about the attack and its aftermath? To tell us more, we're joined now by Middle East Eye U.S. reporter Sean Matthews. Sean, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me on, Mohammed.
I know that you left D.C. just a couple of days ago, but no doubt you would have woken up, and a lot of people in your network, colleagues, friends, people that are still in the city would have been reacting to this shooting. How would you describe the mood this morning in the Capitol?
Yeah, I think the whole world is reacting because I think it's a shock to DC, right? Because the American Capitol is not where especially Israel would expect an act of violence to take place, right, against its own staff members. So I think a sense of shock and probably vulnerability also for all the embassies that are based in DC is what we're experiencing right now. And of course, the staffers were extremely young who were killed. Aaron was years old, Sarah 26. So I think also that's probably playing on a lot of people's minds.
This incident has been described by officials as an anti-Semitic attack. What do we know, if anything, about the motivation of the suspect?
Yeah, look, right before I came on the show, I was reviewing, it looks like Arabic and English media reports are carrying a letter from Rodriguez, a so-called manifesto that he left apparently to be read after this shooting, and he's the suspect, I'll say again. But it looks like he is very much citing Israel's war on Gaza as his motivation for this shooting. He discusses what he calls Israel's genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. He cites at length kind of armed resistance. He makes 2 references that were very interesting to me. One is the reference to Aaron Bushnell, the U.S. service member who self-immolated himself in protest over Israel's war on Gaza. And he also cites former U.S. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, the 60s defense secretary who was involved in the Vietnam War. And he talks about how McNamara was someone tried to push McNamara on a ferry in protest to the war in Vietnam. So I thought that was interesting that Rodriguez cited those 2 cases. But again, the Bushnell case incident stood out to me. And he also mentions clearly this war in Gaza. So from my take, reading this manifesto, it looks like he's linking this killing to the war in Gaza.
Now, this is something that took place in the heart of Washington, D.C., in between those embassies, just a stone's throw away from Capitol Hill. How significant is that?
Yeah, it's significant. Look, we should say that, the shooting didn't take place at the Israeli embassy. We should be clear about that, right? It was at a museum the Jewish Museum in the capital, so not exactly at the embassy. But like embassies anywhere else in the world, anywhere in the West, let's say in the U.S. or European capitals, embassies are fairly lightly guarded. There's a security guard outside. In Washington, a lot of embassies are right there at street level, on the sidewalk, and workers come and go. So even embassies themselves, when you think about it, they're not behind barricades like we think about in Iraq, the Green Zone, right? The U.S. Embassy in Iraq, where you have kind of legions of U.S. soldiers. That's not how it is in the U.S. or European capitals, for that matter, right? So embassies are fairly vulnerable, and I'm sure this is going to raise a lot of concerns among the Israelis regarding their embassies, basically across the West, in South America, in America, and in Europe.
Now, without getting too much into the manifesto or kind of motives or things like that, but it is impossible not to draw a connection between the ongoing war, genocide in Gaza, that 19 months in right now. And since the breakdown of the ceasefire back in March, when a lot of people were hopeful would be the resolution to what was happening in Gaza, the situation has since continued to be increasingly desperate and hopeless. Where are we at right now? Is there an off-ramp on the horizon?
Yeah, Mohammed, it is something to see. Look, I mean, I'm in DC. I go to the region often also, and whether I speak with U.S. officials, Arab officials, just observers or analysts, there is this sense that this war is just kind of dragging on, and that we have reached this point where something has to break, but it's not breaking. And this week was a great example of that. Yesterday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he gave a press conference, a briefing, and he basically laid conditions to end the war in Gaza. And he said that one of the conditions was the enactment of U.S. President Donald Trump's Riviera plan, which calls for a forced displacement of Palestinians and turning Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East. And that was one of the conditions that he had to end. So the forced displacement of Palestinians, 2 million Palestinians from the Strip. I mean, if that's the condition to end the war, I think we are in a situation where, it's looking increasingly hopeless for people who are hoping to see some kind of a ceasefire, because the Israeli conditions at this stage, they're a non-starter. The only thing that the Israelis are really contemplating, it looks like, is a temporary ceasefire, in which they would, take back the 20 or so remaining hostages, and then reserve their right to go back to war in Gaza. And they've been very open about that's what they want. And that's why these negotiations are stuck, right? So I think there is very much a sense of kind of drift of just dragging this conflict out. And it doesn't really seem like there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And I think, the political violence that we just witnessed today, the extremism, this could grow, right? It very much could grow. So it's a very dangerous time, I think. And there is not a lot of momentum behind diplomacy. You're not hearing that. You're not seeing that right now, right? We're seeing the Israeli demands. We're seeing aid not getting into Gaza. But again, not a lot of movement that gives people hope that this conflict is coming to an end anytime soon.
Sean Matthews, Middle East Eyes, U.S. reporter. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Mohammed.
Now let's talk about motive and justice. In his alleged 900-word manifesto, Elias Rodriguez justifies his attack on the Capital Jewish Museum by saying, quote, "I am glad that today at least there are many Americans for which the action will be highly legible and in some funny way the only sane thing to do." Now, it is deeply alarming to hear this act of political violence, which Rodriguez describes as an armed action, being connected to the horror we have seen in Gaza. It's hard not to draw parallels with two other acts of political violence we've seen in recent months, both justified as acts of justice. The first was the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, which narrowly missed the then presidential candidate and killed an innocent supporter in the stands, 50-year-old Corey Compertor. And of course, there was the killing of United Health CEO Brian Thompson, for which Luigi Mangione is now standing trial in New York. Political violence does not usually occur in a vacuum. It happens when a generation of young people loses faith in the rule of law, when they no longer feel seen or heard, when they no longer believe in the ability of their leaders to seek justice on their behalf. But it rarely, if ever, achieves its outcomes, justified or otherwise. The murder of these two diplomatic staff one of whom is a Christian, achieves no justice for the lives of 53,000 Palestinians killed by Israel over the last 19 months, not the 16,000 children dead, not the 10,000 still buried under rubble, the thousands more at risk now of starvation. Instead, it plays into the hands of the Israeli government, who have no issue spinning it to serve their own political aims. Just listen to Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar.
This is what happens when leaders in the world surrender to the Palestinian terrorist propaganda and serve it. The statements and attacks blame Israel instead of Hamas. Hamas started the war on October 7th, is solely responsible for the war's continuation, and is solely responsible for the suffering of Israelis and Palestinians alike.
Despite the strong stance Sa'ar takes, he understands something else to be true. Israel has been increasingly isolated on the world stage. It has lost the battle for public opinion, and it is fast losing its political support from its allies. But here is another response to what we saw last night from a group of Jewish Americans who have been fighting for Palestinian rights. They said this, quote, "In the wake of this attack, many Jews are fearful of gathering in Jewish communal spaces and being visible as Jews. Through our grief, we wrestle with their added fear that these murders will be used to justify further acts of violence and state repression. When we allow our hearts to harden to such an extent that we shrug off acts of violence and treat someone's identity as grounds to deny their humanity, we lose our own humanity in the process. This is true when we dehumanize Palestinians, and when we dehumanize Israelis, neither is acceptable." There are those who have already expressed support online for what happened in Washington, D.C. last night, seeing it as an extension of a just struggle. They are in the minority, but they are there. To those people, I have one simple question. What has it achieved? Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for watching. That is all we have for you today. But before we lose you, please, we want to hear your thoughts on both of these stories.
Please, you can comment in the YouTube itself, or you can contact us across social media platforms at Middle East Eye. You can also email MEELive at middleeasteye.net.
Make sure you hit your notification bell so that you know exactly when we go live every Tuesday, every Thursday, 5 p.m. if you're in the UK, 12 p.m. if you're in New York or DC.
See you then.